In the very first episode of this series, we talked about the gap between admiring Jesus and actually taking his claims seriously. In this episode, this is where that gap comes into focus. Welcome back to Align Podcast. This is the final episode of this series, The Verdict. Who do you say that I am? You can admire Jesus, you can respect him as a teacher. You can quote him on forgiveness, on love. But from the very beginning, the question underneath all of that has never been, do I like Jesus? The real question has always been, who is Jesus? Over these episodes, we've asked whether the stories that we've heard about him are historically correct or even serious. Who wrote the Gospels? Whether the texts have been corrupted? What kind of writings are they? Whether Jesus claimed to be God? Why he was crucified? And whether the stories of his resurrection have any real historical value. Now we've come to the place where information bumps into response. After walking through all of this together, has anything shifted? Even a little bit. This episode is not about pressure. It is about honesty. Given what you've heard, what do you say about the personality of Jesus? Because this series didn't begin with a demand for belief. It began with a question. In episode 1, we asked why the question of Jesus refused to disappear from history. 2,000 years later, in a world that has seen empires rise and fall, scientific revolution reshaping our understanding of the universe and technology, transforming nearly every part of life, the figure of Jesus of Nazareth still sits at the corner and the center of global conversation. We also made an important distinction there, the difference between the cultural Jesus and the historical Jesus. The cultural Jesus is the one that people shapes according to their preference, a symbol of kindness, a moral teacher, a spiritual mascot for whatever values we already hold. But then there's the historical Jesus, who is not that easy to bend and twist. The historical Jesus confronts us with claims, with actions and consequences that demand to be taken seriously. In episodes 2 and 3, we started asking whether the sources themselves deserve that seriousness. We looked at who wrote the Gospels and why that question matters. Are these anonymous legends that grew over centuries, or do they come from within the earliest Christian movement, connected to eyewitness testimonies and the early communities who preserved these memories very carefully? Then we asked whether the texts we have today have been corrupted over time. What about the manuscript transmission? And what about the so-called lost gospels that sometimes appear in documentaries or even in headlines? What we saw was something many people don't realize. The New Testament documents are actually amongst the most well-attested writings from the ancient world. The core story about Jesus hasn't drifted or mutated beyond recognition. It has been remarkably stable across centuries of copying and preservation. In episode 4, we stepped back and asked a broader question. What kind of writings are the Gospels in the first place? Are they myth? Are they theological propaganda? Or do they even fit the pattern of ancient biographies? Accounts that have been written to preserve the life, the teaching, and the significance of a person. And when we place them in the literary context of the ancient world, something interesting emerged. The Gospels read much less like myth and much more like ancient biography, grounded in real places, connected to real historical figures, and focused on the actions and characters of a particular individual. In episode 5, we moved closer to the center of the question by asking what Jesus actually claimed about himself. Not what later theology said about him, but what he said about himself. Not what modern culture wishes or believes, but what the earliest and most reliable accounts present about him. We looked at the titles of Son of Man, Son of God, the striking I am language, and the way he forgave people, accepted worship, and even spoke with authority that went beyond the prophets and teachers of his time. And we saw why the idea that Jesus was just a moral teacher doesn't really fit the historical picture. In episode 6, we walked into one of the darkest and most important moments in the story. We asked a question that's both historical and personal. Why would a man known for compassion, for healing, for teaching about love, end up executed by the Roman Empire? And what we saw is that his death was not a random accident in history. It was the result of intense tension, political tension with the Roman authorities and religious tension with the leaders who saw his claims as dangerous and the disruptive way his message challenged existing power structures. And then in episode 7, we came to the claim that sits at the very center of Christianity, the resurrection. We looked at the historical piece that makes up that claim, the empty tomb, the eyewitness testimonies, the early proclamation of the church, and the transformation of Jesus' followers. We also walked through some of the alternative explanations that people have offered over the years, asking an honest question. Which explanation best accounts for the evidence we have about the empty tomb? Now, after walking through all of that, something important should be clear. The picture of Jesus that emerges from this investigation is not simple and it's not comfortable. It is not the polished, easy, digestible version of Jesus that fits neatly into modern slogans. Instead, what emerges is a figure who is historically rooted, theologically provocative, and deeply challenging. A man whose life sparked a movement, whose death shocked his followers, and whose claimed resurrection ignited a conviction that reshaped the ancient world. And all of that brings us to the moment we've been moving towards from the very beginning. Because once you take the question seriously, once you engage the evidence and the history, you eventually arrive at the same place the first followers did. You have to decide what to do with him. There's a moment in the gospel that pulls everything we've been discussing into one sharp, unavoidable question. It happens in a place called Caesarea Philippi. Now, this location matters more than we might realize at first glance. Caesarea Philippi sat at the northern region of Israel, near the base of Mount Hermon. It was known as a center of pagan worship. There were shrines there dedicated to various gods, including the Greek god Pan, and later temples built in honor of Caesar Augustus. In other words, it is a common place filled with competing claims about divinity and authority. Statues, temples, and sacred spaces all pointing to different answers to the question of who or what deserves ultimate allegiance. And it is in that setting, surrounded by symbols of power, religion, and empire, that Jesus turns to his disciples and asks a simple but profound question. Who do people say that I am? Now, that question in itself is interesting, and here's why. As a leader of people, or even as a parent, sometimes you ask a question not because you lack the information, but because you want the person hearing the question to pause and think. You're inviting reflection when you do such thing. I'm not saying that that's exactly what Jesus was doing here, but from my perspective, it feels very similar. It's almost as if he's creating the space for his followers to process what they've been hearing, what they've been seeing, and all the things that they've been a part of for so long. So the disciples respond with a range of opinions that were circulating at that particular time. Some say you're John the Baptist, others say you're Elijah. Still, others say you are one of the prophets. In other words, the public conversation about Jesus had already reached an interesting conclusion at this time. People recognized that something unusual was happening. They heard his teachings, they saw his authority, and the way he carried himself. They heard the reports of miracles, so they placed him into categories they already understood. A prophet, a spiritual reformer, a man sent by God into their lives in a significant way. But then Jesus takes the conversation one step deeper. He looks directly at his disciples and asks, "But who do you say that I am?" Notice what just happened here. The question moved from the safety of public opinion to the vulnerability of personal conviction. It's one thing to talk about what other people believe. It's something much, much more harder to say what you believe. And that's when Simon Peter steps forward and gives an answer. His answer echoes across history. It says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." This statement is more than admiration. It's more than respect. Peter isn't just saying you're an inspiring teacher. He's saying you are the Messiah, the one God promised us, the one God sent to bring his rule and restoration over our lives. It is a recognition that Jesus is not merely pointing people towards God. He's standing at the center of what God is doing. Now, it's important to remember that Peter did not suddenly understand everything at that moment. If you keep reading the scriptures, if you keep reading the gospels, you will see that Peter still struggled. He misunderstood Jesus. He misunderstood the mission. He resists the ideas of his suffering. Later, in one of the most painful moments of the story, he even denies knowing Jesus. So Peter's confession is not the arrival of perfect clarity. It is the crossing of a line, the moment when admiration becomes recognition. It is the moment when someone moves from saying Jesus is impressive to saying Jesus is who he claims to be. And what's remarkable is that this question doesn't stay with the first century. It doesn't stay in that conversation near Caesarea of Philippi. This question echoed forward, and it still echoes today. It echoes through every generation that has encountered the story of Jesus. It hangs over every page of the New Testament. It hangs over centuries of philosophy, theology, skepticism, faith. It hangs over the rise and fall of civilization. It hangs over every advancement humanity has made, technologically, culturally, intellectually. No matter how far the world moves forward, the question somehow follows us. Who do you say that he is? And in a very real sense, that question now hangs over this series as well. If you've walked through these episodes with us, the authorship of the gospel, the reliability of the text, the nature of the writings, the claims Jesus made, the crucifixion and the resurrection, then eventually you'll arrive at the same place the first disciples did. You can't stay neutral forever. You must make a decision. You might say, "I'm still thinking about it," or "I'm not convinced," or maybe "I believe." One way or another, the question presses towards an answer. Because at some point, every person who seriously engages with the story of Jesus has to respond. Even if the response is simply, "I'm not ready yet." That moment we just talked about, when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" brings us to an important realization. Questions like that are where evidence meets decision. And it's important to say something clearly here. Evidence can take us to the threshold, but it cannot walk us through the door. Over the course of this series, we've tried to look carefully at the historical side of the story. We asked whether the Gospels are rooted in early testimony. We looked at the stability of the manuscript. We examined the type of literature the Gospels are and whether they resemble myth or biography. We looked at the claims Jesus made about himself, the reasons behind his crucifixion, and the historical case surrounding the resurrection. All of that matters because belief about Jesus shouldn't rest on misunderstanding rumors or secondhand caricatures. But at the same time, historical investigation has its natural limits. History can point us towards what is most reasonable. It can show us what explanations makes the most sense of evidence. It can challenge assumptions that may not hold up under scrutiny. But eventually, history hands the question back to the individual. At some point, the question stops being purely academic. It becomes personal. You move from asking, is this historically plausible, to asking, what do I do with the evidence? And that shift is significant because recognizing that something might be true is definitely different from trusting that it is true. Think about it this way. We make decisions like this all the time in our everyday lives. When you board an airplane, you don't have absolute certainty about every mechanical component or every weather pattern or even every variable in the flight ahead. You're not personally inspecting the engines or recalculating the physics of aerodynamics, but you have seen enough evidence, you have seen enough track record of aviation, the systems in place, the experience of the pilots, the millions of successful flights that happen every year. You've seen enough to trust that the plane will likely get you to where you're going. You don't have perfect certainty, but you have enough sufficient reason to place your trust there. And in many ways, the question of Jesus works similarly. Evidence can show you that the stories about him is historically grounded. It can show you that the easy dismissals, the idea of the Gospels being late myth, or that the resurrection was simply invented centuries later, those ideas don't hold up as well as some people assume. But once you see that, you still have to decide what to do with the information that you've gathered. And people land in different places. Maybe after walking through the series, you find yourself saying, I don't know yet. You can see that the story of Jesus is more historically serious than you may have expected. Some of your assumptions may have been challenged, but you still have questions. You're curious, but you're not ready to draw final conclusion. That's an honest place to be. Some listeners might say, well, I'm not convinced. You've heard the arguments, you understand the reasoning, but at the end of the day, you still lean towards a naturalistic explanation for what happened. Or maybe certain doubts remain too strong for you to move past right now. That's also an honest place to stand. And then there are others that may be listening who may find themselves saying, I'm persuaded. Not every question has been answered. Not every mystery has disappeared, but you've come to believe that Jesus is who he claimed to be. That his life, his death, his resurrection are not just religious ideas, but real events with real implications on how we understand ourselves, how we understand God, and how we understand the world. Wherever you are on that spectrum, the key thing is honesty. Don't pretend to believe something you actually don't believe. But also, don't pretend not to care if somewhere underneath the surface, this question is beginning to matter to you more than you expected. Intellectual integrity means being truthful about where you really stand. The only place a person can move forward from is the place where they are honest about. And that's where the question of Jesus ultimately leaves each of us. Not just evaluating the evidence, but deciding what to do with the evidence that we've gathered. That brings us to a word that often carries a lot of baggage: faith. For many people, faith is misunderstood before the conversation even begins, and that's understandable. In popular culture, faith is sometimes portrayed as a blind leap into the dark, a decision to believe something precisely because it doesn't make sense. You may have heard phrases like, you just have to have faith, used in a way that sounds like stop asking questions or just turn off your brains. And if that were what faith meant, skepticism would actually be the most reasonable response. But historically, and in the Christian sense, Faith means something quite different. Faith is not pretending something is true when you secretly think it isn't. Faith is trusting based on what you have come to see as trustworthy. It's the point where evidence, experience, and reflection leads you to place your weight somewhere. It doesn't mean you suddenly have perfect certainty about every detail. Very, very few meaningful decisions in life come with that kind of certainty, that type of assurance. Think about some of the most important comments people make. When someone gets married, they don't have a mathematical proof about the entire future of that relationship. They don't know every challenge that will come, every season of life that would bring about, but they have seen enough of the other person's character. They have seen enough of their honesty. They've seen enough of care. They've seen enough consistency to say, I'm willing to entrust my life in this relationship. That's not irrational. It's trust formed through experience and evidence. You don't know the future with absolute certainty, but you trust based on what you know. In a similar way, faith in the Christian sense is not a leap into the dark. No, absolutely not. It's more like stepping into the light you've already been given. It is saying, based on what I've come to see about Jesus, his life, his teaching, his death, and the claims of his resurrection, I am willing to trust him with my life. Now, that trust can look different depending on where you are in your journey of life. For a believer that's listening, maybe this series has helped you connect your faith to the deeper historical roots. Many people grow up with faith as something inherited, something meaningful, but sometimes fragile because it hasn't been examined closely. Seeing the historical foundation behind the stories of Jesus, that can strengthen your faith. It can remind you that belief in Jesus isn't just tradition, isn't just something that you inherited. It's connected to real people, real events, and a real movement in history. For some, in that position, faith might look like allowing your trust to grow deeper. It might look like letting it shape not just one part of life, but more of your decisions, your relationships, your priorities, and everything you encounter. But for the skeptics or the unsure listeners, faith doesn't necessarily mean making a sudden dramatic declaration. Faith might begin much more quietly than that. It might look like deciding to read one of the Gospels for yourself, not through someone else's lens or commentary, but directly. It might look like choosing to pray for the first time in a really, really, really long time, even if prayer feels uncertain to you. Something as simple as saying, God, if you're there, and if Jesus is who he really claims to be, show me. That kind of honesty is not weakness. It's actually the beginning of a genuine seeking. Faith is not a one-time emotional spike or a moment of pressure. It's an ongoing posture towards the one that we have come to see as trustworthy. And like any relationship, that trust grows over time. It grows through learning. It grows through questioning. It grows through moments of doubt, reflection, and even discovery. Which means faith is not the opposite of thinking. In many ways, it is the place where thinking, evidence, and trust finally meets. I want to be very clear here. This is an invitation, not a manipulation. I'm not interested in talking you into saying words you don't mean. I'm not interested in scoring decisions. I care that you live honestly in light of what you believe is true. So here's the invitation. Keep going. Number one, keep asking questions. Send them in. Wrestle with them. Don't be afraid of them. God is definitely not scared of your questions. Number two, revisit earlier episodes if something wasn't clear. And return to step one. Ask questions. Number three, and most importantly, I cannot overemphasize this. Go to the sources themselves. Read one of the Gospels from start to finish. Pay attention to how Jesus speaks, what he says, how people respond to him. And that persistent question, who is this? If after all of that you are unsettled in your current place, or you are led to reconsider your current position, that's Jesus revealing himself to you, knocking on the door of your heart. I encourage you to answer the door, to accept his invitation, and to welcome him into your life. Talk to him like you would a friend, a new friend that you just found. That's you praying. Study more scripture. That's you creating space for him to commune with you. I encourage you to cherish and protect this new relationship you found. Look for a Bible-believing group of people that would help protect and foster to grow this relationship you found. This is your responsibility. Protect it at all costs. The disciples of Jesus did the same. They protected the truth of Jesus with their lives. And if you still have questions, I plan to do a follow-up Q&A or bonus episodes where we tackle some of the hardest questions that have come up as a result of this series. I'm talking about questions about suffering, about other religions, doubts, and any other thing you might have. You're invited to share in this ongoing conversation. As we close this series, I want to say two simple things. Thank you and remember. Thank you. Thank you for making this journey from authorship and manuscript to biography and myth, from claims of divinity to a Roman cross and to an empty tomb. You could have spent these hours on countless other things, but you chose to grapple with the question of Jesus. That matters. Thank you. Remember, the question of Jesus won't go away. You can delay it, you can push it to the edges, you can even drown it out with noise, but it is still there. Who do you say he is? Whatever you decide, that answer will shape how you see yourself, how you see other people, how you see suffering, how you see hope, and how you see the future. It's not just a religious opinion, it is a foundation. My hope is that this series has given you not just arguments, but a space to think, a space to doubt, a space to hope, a space for some maybe to trust. Thank you for listening to Align Podcast and for walking through the case for Jesus with me. Cheers.